Welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Nick Klomp, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Canberra. Michelle.
Hi, Nick.
What was supposed to be a probe into an Australian Workers' Union's donation to GetUp has backfired on the government this week, with a senior staffer of Employment Minister Michaelia Cash forced to quit after tipping off the media about the police raids. The opposition has called for Senator Cash's resignation, claiming she misled the Senate over this matter. Is that a reasonable call?
Well, it's what oppositions do in this situation because it's been very embarrassing for the government. There's no doubt about that. Senator Cash was for a day claiming that she knew nothing of any source of the tip-off, and then of course she had to say her staffer had fessed up and he'd resigned. But I think that if she is honestly saying she didn't know, that it's not a resignation matter, but certainly it's a poor look, and as you say, it's completely backfired on the government and it's very embarrassing.
So typically people wouldn't be asked to resign over this when they've just made an honest mistake. Is that the argument?
Well, there are a few arguments here. Ministers are held on to these days much more than political theory would suggest they should be. That's the first thing. But secondly, I think that it's a question of how serious the thing is, and whether a minister is responsible for their staffer, but whether they should pay the ultimate price when the staffer has resigned, I think it's a political judgment, really. There's no absolute rule on this.
During question time on Thursday, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull read a statement from the Australian Federal Police defending their independence and integrity. This was in response to accusations that the government had directed them to raid the AWU. Is there much basis to the fear of a politicised police force?
I think very much the police were the meat and the sandwich in this affair. There was a warrant sought by the Registered Organisations Commission for the documents to be seized from the AWU, and the police carry out that warrant. But the argument that they're directed by the government is a wrong argument. They're not directed by the government, they're doing their job. Beyond that, though, I think that the police wouldn't like to have to be in this situation because it is a political situation, and in general I think that the police are uncomfortable when they find themselves somehow in the middle of the political fray. Often the police are called on to be there with ministers when announcements are made. Now, sometimes this is perfectly fine and appropriate. Other times these are more political announcements, and the authority of the uniform is being used as a backdrop, and that's uncomfortable for the police.
The other big issue of the week was the problems with the National Broadband Network, which has led to many customer complaints and questions about its finances. Should Australians be embarrassed or annoyed by findings in the Four Corners program that New Zealand has a superior network than Australia?
I think many would be annoyed, and clearly the rollout of this network is not going 100% well. People are finding that they're not getting the service they think they signed up for, and speeds are slow, and there are all sorts of glitches. The NBN really has been a problem from the start. The Labor government promised a gold-plated scheme. The Liberals then said this can't be afforded, and we've got now a scheme which mixes technologies. It's not first class. Whether these are basically teething problems and will iron out from the consumer's point of view as the thing goes on, well, we have to see. But certainly financially, NBN is much more burdensome than initially thought. So it is a bit of an albatross for the government, and it's one of those issues that of course is a consumer issue. It's not just a theoretical issue or something that's well removed from people. That and energy prices are things that affect most households all the time.
The Prime Minister has announced that the government has abandoned calls for an Indigenous advisory body with constitutional status, apparently calling the proposal too ambitious. Where does this leave us on constitutional reform more generally?
Well, on the whole question of recognising Indigenous people in the Constitution, I think it leaves us back at square one, really. This call for an Indigenous body has been late into this debate about giving the Indigenous people a voice in the Constitution, or a presence in the Constitution. And I think that from the time that the Reconciliation Council proposed it a few months ago, it was always doomed because it was just too ambitious to get support in a referendum. The government knows that, but it's a sad story, this one of Indigenous recognition, because it started off with high hopes that the Indigenous people, Australia's first people, could be recognised in the Constitution. There seemed to be broad agreement for that, and since then the whole debate's fragmented. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have indicated they want more than symbolism. The general community is, I think, not willing to go along with anything that's too radical, and therefore the chances of a referendum, and remember Tony Abbott hoped that that referendum for constitutional change would be this year, would have been in May, the chances for a referendum even being put, let alone succeeding, are now very limited for the foreseeable future. And of course the government does not want to take a chance on these things. It doesn't want to put a referendum to the people that isn't pretty guaranteed of getting support.
Michelle, of course, we're still waiting for the High Court's decision.
Hours away.
Yes. So let's talk about that next week.
Thanks, Vic.
Thanks, Michelle.